So Seth Kahan, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome. We're delighted to have you, Seth.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Oops. You hear me okay? Great. It's good to be here. It's good to be back after 5 years. This work that I do got started in a rather unorthodox way. I was in graduate school in mathematics at Indiana University, and a friend of mine went to Noe, Poland to investigate his roots. His name was Timothy Noe. And when he came back, he brought tales of Jerzy Grotowski. Anybody heard of Jerzy Grotowski? Anybody seen the movie My Dinner with Andre? A couple of heads nodding. They talk about Jerzy Grotowski a lot in that movie. Jerzy Grotowski was one of the really most profound researchers in the field of theater. And he was studying what is the essence of theater. If you really boil it down to its core, what is left? And he came up with only two things. He wrote a book about this called Towards a Poor Theater. And when he used the term poor theater, what he meant was a theater without a laser light show, a theater without a grand stage, a theater without expensive costumes, a theater without marketing. What do you think was left? There were only two things. Story is a good guess, probably one I would have made, but that's not it. What? Audience is one of them, and actors is the other. Theater, in its essence, is really made of someone, like in this instance, I could be the actor, someone who's got a message or a story or performance of some type, and someone who's watching or listening. And so what that means is that when you're sitting with your niece and she's spinning around doing pirouettes in a clumsy kind of fashion, because maybe she's only 3 years old, you know, and you're watching, you're actually engaged in the very essence of human drama right there, just as much as you are when you travel to the Kennedy Center and sit down for a grand performance. Well, I got interested in Grotowski's work, and I decided to put on a show. So I put on a show at Dunmeadow, which is a football-sized field at Indiana University, and I was not confident that I would be able to get an audience. So I decided to steal one. So what I did was that I looked in the paper and found when a couple of guys who were pretty well known in town were going to be playing their guitars at Dunmeadow in front of an audience, and I decided that my troupe would set up adjacent to them, and as soon as they were done, we would start performing. They gathered about 100 folks, so these are college kids, you know, got their backpacks out, sitting back on their hands on the grass, watching on a small stage, and I put together this very strange performance. I had a friend, Kimon, who played bass trombone in the IU Jazz Band, and he was wearing a very large rubber Nixon mask with the big ski jump nose. I had a troupe of dancers who were dressed in camouflage and leotards. And I had hair like this and a beard like this, and I was wearing a jumpsuit, and so did a friend of mine. We kind of looked like Neanderthals in mechanics outfits. And as soon as these guys stopped playing guitar, we moved out. So my friend Kim came out squonking kind of anti-jazz on his bass trombone, and I jumped out and started reciting poetry, and the dancers came out. And there was this moment where the audience kind of checked us out, you know, scooted around a little bit, and then about 80% of them decided to stay. And that was a big win for us. And so we jumped into our show and we performed for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then something happened that changed my life and is the subject of what I'm going to talk about today. The audience joined in. First they came up and they started doing, you know, kind of fun college student abstract dance along with everybody else, a few here and there. And then it turned into kind of a flow from the audience into the performing area until it was difficult for me to tell who was in my troupe and who had showed up to watch. And eventually they formed a conga line. So they put hands on the hips or shoulders of the person in front of them and a long string of about 60 to 80 college students, and they made up this poem, which I still remember, and it went like this. I used to know somebody who used to be somebody who used to know somebody you used to be. I used to be somebody who used to know somebody who used to be somebody you used to know. And we recited it over and over and over again until we collapsed laughing in the grass. And I thought to myself, now isn't it interesting that people joined in, that they became part of what we were doing? I thought this was really, really interesting because if you think about it, getting someone to cross that line is hard. Think about a change program. Getting someone to go from being a passive observer to being someone who's engaged in it. Well, when you're doing street theater, like we were doing, you know, your audience is always on their way somewhere else. So it's one thing to grab them. You can grab people by doing something strange or shocking. But it's another thing for them to decide to stay. And it's even another thing for them to become involved. And that's what I became interested in. I ended up dropping out of graduate school. I did street theater for 10 years. I performed in shopping malls and vacant lots. I performed downtown DC in a lot of places. And I brought artists together. Musicians, dancers, poets, people who wanted to be artists but weren't professionals. And I worked on creating compelling art in public spaces that involved the people who were watching. Now, when I first got my job at the World Bank, which was in 1989, this was a day job for me so that I could do this strange performance theater. You know, that was the love of my life. This was really just a way to pay the bills. And I did it for about 6 or 7 years. I taught people how to use the different systems in the World Bank. I taught them how to use budget and procurement and project supervision. I kind of absorbed the bank's, you know, mission and organization by osmosis because I was teaching people, but really what I lived for were those performances. I worked out of St. Stephen's Church here in Washington, D.C. at 16th and Newton. Well, something happened in 1996, about 7 years in, that changed everything for me. I decided to leave the bank. I decided to put on a performance piece using a PC. This was in 96, 14 years ago. Back then, Netscape had just landed on the desktop. And so I decided, as my swan song, as I was saying goodbye to my colleagues at the World Bank, that I would teach them about the internet. And I set up a live PC in one of our big conference rooms. It was actually about this size. And I showed them HTML. Those of you who were working with Netscape remember the blue underlined text. And this was back when people were still picking up the mice and saying, you know, how does this thing work and all that. And I talked about how when you clicked on the blue underlined text, all these little packets would run out of the back of the PC, travel down the cable, go through the bank's T1 line, find the fiber optic backbone up in Rockville, and then shoot off to China or Brazil, send a message, bring a lot of packets back with them, and if any of them got lost along the way, they could go back and get them, route themselves around. This was the World Wide Web, so they could go around anything that might obstruct them, come back through the fiber optic backbone, back through the bank's T1 line, climb up to the back of the PC and display on the screen in less than 2 seconds. And in 1996, this made mouths drop open. People were like amazed, you know? This was incredible. Well, that little piece that I did was a huge success in the organization. And I couldn't leave. People asked me to show about the internet all over, and they videotaped me, sent them around the world. But there was one group that used to sit in the back of the room and watch me and never really participate. And after about 12 months of me doing this presentation, they came up and they said, we want you to take your performance skills, take your storytelling skills, and use them to help change the culture of the institution. We want people to understand how to share what they know to serve our clients better. And we want to move from a knowledge hoarding institution to a knowledge sharing institution. And so I got essentially drafted. I was given an offer I couldn't refuse. I decided not to leave the bank. And I started participating. And I started using those same skills that I used in the street to get people involved in meetings to get them involved. Now, this initiative was a huge success. We went in 2 years from an unfunded idea to $60 million in annual allocations. We went from zero resources to having tens of thousands of people participate around the world in our program in just 2 years. We built 120 communities that crossed the organizational boundaries, not just internally, but externally. And in fact, to this day, there was recently, about 18 months ago, they did an audit to see how many of those communities still are in existence. And despite the budget getting pulled and put back in and pulled, and the pendulum swinging from decentralization to centralization, and presidents coming and going under nefarious circumstances, despite all of this change in the organization, there are over 60 of those communities still up and running to this day, which is pretty dramatic. So, since that time, I have worked in many different organizations using the principles I'm going to show you to get people involved in large-scale change. But there's something I want to tell you about this first change initiative that most people don't know who are involved in it. There were actually two. The first one that I was involved in lasted a year, and in my opinion was a huge failure. What happened when I first got drafted was that there was this small group of people, I was one of them, there was probably about 8 of us, and we were tasked with this idea, this vision. And the vision was, what if the bank's knowledge and information was available all over the world to the people who most needed it when they needed it? That was the vision. And so these high-paid consultants were brought in to work with people like me and other folks in the IT department, and we were to build an intranet. Now, this was back when nobody knew what an intranet was. And for those of you who don't, an intranet is really an intranet that's inside the walls of the organization. We were going to build an intranet. There was a lot of visibility. The president knew what we were doing. The CIO knew what we were doing. There was a lot of pressure to perform. We would get together in tiny little conference rooms with a single PC, and we would see all these cool, sexy things, and people would be oohing and eyeing. And after a year of doing this, it was still just the 8 of us who knew what we were doing. And I said, that's it. This is going nowhere. I'm out of here. I found another job in the organization, and I was literally hand-typing my letter of resignation saying, I'm bailing from this program. When someone stuck their head in my office, Steve Denning, he's written about quite a bit in my book, Steve said, what are you doing, Seth? And I said, I'm out of here. This initiative's tanking. Nothing's happening. Nobody knows what we're doing. And Steve said, give me 5 minutes. 5 minutes later, I was called into the CIO's office, and I was loaned to Steve. So was someone else, Leslie Schneer. She and I were the only resources he had except for half of an executive assistant. He had no budget. We were on loan. It was with Steve that this dramatic change happened. With no budget, with no visibility, with no pressure, with nothing, we went from a great idea to $60 million in annual allocations in 2 years. So I tell you this because what Steve did that was different from what the first group did was that he found a way to tell as many people as possible about what we were doing and to get them involved. And that's what I did on the street, was get people involved. And we used some of the same skills in our business meetings as I used on the street to create engagement, to create participation, contribution. And that leads to buy-in, that leads to ownership, and that leads to rapid, widespread change. Our change went so fast we couldn't keep track of it. It was often the case that people would come tell us what they were doing. Now you have to remember, we had no budget, zero. So we couldn't supervise anything. We couldn't micromanage. We were at the opposite end of the spectrum. It was kind of like we were throwing seeds on the soil and just hoping that they were going to take root because we couldn't stick around to water them or anything. And what happened was it started coming in from all over the world to us. And that's when we realized that we were really onto something. The technology that we used was human-centered. It was essentially community building and storytelling. Of course we used the internet, the intranet, we used our PCs, but what we really did was get change to spread belly to belly. That's what it was about. Now since that time, and I'll share with you some of the organizations I've worked with, since that time I've worked with about 30 organizations, about 6 on really large scale change, including the Peace Corps. I worked for 2.5 years with Gadi Vasquez on his strategy there. I worked at Royal Dutch Shell for 2.5 years on a $20 million technology initiative, and several other really large organizations. And I've had the chance to interface with about 60 CEOs or directors of agencies and talk with them about change. And I'll tell you where they go wrong because I've been exposed to it. Here's typically what happens in a change initiative that fails, and most of them, as you know, fail. You get a bunch of people together in a room who have a really good idea, and the ideas are good. They get excited about it, they get fire in their belly, it keeps them up at night, they think about it, they research, they read, they talk to other people, and then they pop out a document.